Yes, he's asking me, please ask the host to give you permission to record. He's saying that. Can the host give me the permission? Ben, I need permission to record.
Hi, Adan. Yes, Sanya should be able to do that. Sanya, can you hear?
Yes, I can doing that.
Thank you.
Great, thanks everyone. I think we're just resolving a few last technical issues. But while we're doing that, I just want to take the opportunity to welcome everybody today to our webinar on costing child wasting treatment. And we're going to focus on an introduction to cost analysis and cost-effective analysis for CMAM. So before we get started, we would like to make a point on translation. So today, the webinar will be delivered in English, but translation is available in 5 languages, and you can access that by clicking the globe icon at the bottom of your screen. So we'd like to thank our 5 translators who have joined us today: Sosten, who will be translating in French; Yalitza, who will be translating in Spanish; Dina, who will be translating in Arabic; Adan, who is translating in Somali; and Petro, who is translating in Swahili. So today's webinar is being recorded. We're doing this so we can share it with anyone who was not able to attend today. We would love to know who has joined us today, so please take the opportunity to introduce yourself in the chat. Please include who you are, your name, and where you're joining from. A few housekeeping rules. Please keep your mics and cameras off to save on bandwidth. And if you have any questions about the presentations or that you'd like to bring to our presenters, please put them in the Q&A box. And you can find that at the bottom of the screen next to the globe icon. We'll try to do our best to answer the questions in real time over the Q&A function. But anything we don't have time for today, we will answer after the webinar and we will share with you all. For any other general questions or comments, please feel free to put those into the chat. This webinar was organised jointly by the Global Nutrition Cluster Technical Alliance and the Wasting Global Technical Working Group, and specifically the Costing Sub-Working Group. On this slide, you can see all of the logos of the member organisations of the webinar working group, as well as our donors, without whom we would not be able to deliver this webinar. So before we move to the webinar itself, a little bit of background to today's webinar. So in 2020, we conducted a review of available evidence on the cost efficiency and effectiveness of the management of child wasting. At the time of the review, there was very little published data on the topic. And of the available evidence, there was a high degree of variance in the findings, suggesting the importance of contextual determinants of cost efficiency and cost effectiveness. However, it also reflected differences in the methods and the data collection and analysis. As a result, in 2021, a working group was formed under the Wasting Global Technical Working Group, focusing on costing and cost effectiveness of child wasting treatment. And this group has got 3 main objectives. Firstly, to raise awareness on the importance and use of cost data for decision-making related to the treatment of wasting. Secondly, to increase the availability and quality of costing data on wasting. And thirdly, to share information related to cost and cost effectiveness of wasting treatment. So today's webinar is the second in a series organised by this working group, and we hope to hold these webinars on a quarterly basis. We have 3 broad objectives for this series. Firstly, to share basic instructions on costing and cost effectiveness analysis for interventions to treat child wasting, to disseminate key resources and to inform the wider nutrition community on the existence of the working group as well. And at the end of today's session, there'll be an opportunity to tell us what you would like to hear about next in this series. So now moving to the outline for today's session, we have two wonderful presenters who I'll introduce shortly, but they'll be covering 5 really interesting topics. Firstly, we'll be getting an introduction to cost effectiveness. We'll then move on to a costing module that has been developed. We'll next move to the basics of daily adjusted life years, and then move on to a specific example of daily adjusted life years with CMAM programs, and then finish with the uncertainty model for daily adjusted life years. And before we leave, there'll also be an opportunity for an evaluation in today's session, where we'll be really happy to hear your feedback. So just to briefly introduce the people on presenting today, we have Chloe Pouet, who is joining us from Stony Brook University, an independent consultant and researcher on public health, and Mark Myatt, an epidemiologist with Brixton Health and also a technical associate at the Emergency Nutrition Network. I'm Emily Keane. I'm a nutrition advisor with Save the Children, and I co-chair the working group together with Bernadette Chinon from Action Against Hunger and Stacey Gobin, also from Save the Children. And Stacey and Bernadette will be responding to kind of questions and answers live during the session. So I think I'm going to pause here and hand to Chloe for her first presentation.
Great, thanks, Emily. Great, okay. So today we're going to be talking about giving you an introduction to cost analysis and cost effectiveness analysis for CMAM. We will present on a few basic components. It's important to understand this topic. First, an overview of cost effectiveness, a cost module, a DALYs module, and then dealing with uncertainty for DALYs. The information we will be presenting draws on information from our recent handbook focusing on cost effectiveness analysis of CMAM programs. Some of the information covered in this handbook includes instruction and considerations for cost effectiveness analysis, specifically for CMAM, DALY calculations for preventing morbidity and mortality attributable to severe acute malnutrition, or SAM, cost data collection templates for CMAM programs, and applied examples of cost and cost effectiveness analyses of CMAM programs in different settings. So let's start with a general overview of cost effectiveness analysis. We usually conduct cost effectiveness analysis when we have outcome data, which tends to be around the time of end-line evaluation of a program, though that doesn't have to be the case. We can also use cost data during program implementation to get a sense of the cost efficiency of a program. That would use output measures of the program, perhaps on a monthly or quarterly basis. For CMAM programs, this tends to be cost per child treated or enrolled. So as you can see already, when we talk about economic evaluation, there are actually several options that each serve a slightly different purpose. All economic evaluations include information on the cost of the intervention, and they combine that with different levels of information about what we get for that cost. Although sometimes we just want to focus only on costs, and there are other analyses like cost minimization or budget impact analysis that do that. So first, at the top row here in our table, cost efficiency analysis focuses on the cost per program output. It does not consider program effectiveness. Commonly for wasting, we use the cost per child treated or enrolled in the program, which tells you something about how many children the program was able to cover, but it doesn't tell you if the program was effective in treating those children. This approach is useful for understanding program coverage and the resource use needed to achieve that. Next row, cost effectiveness analysis, goes a step further and tells you how effective the intervention was relative to its costs. When we look at results of a cost effectiveness analysis, we have a cost per disease-related outcome, and we can compare among other programs treating that same outcome. For wasting, this is usually the cost per child recovered from wasting. But sometimes we want to see how cost effective is this intervention compared with a broader set of programs, treating all different kinds of diseases in order to aid in priority setting. Cost utility analysis in the next row gives us this information by using what are called utility-based metrics, such as disability adjusted life years, or DALYs. For any specific disease, you can calculate the death and disability caused by that disease, which you are preventing with your intervention, and then compare the cost per DALY with other interventions addressing all different kinds of diseases. Mark will be talking more about calculating DALYs for wasting in his presentations. Finally, last row in benefit cost analysis, we sidestep all specific disease-related measurements, and we just compare the cost of an intervention relative to the monetary value of the benefits it produces. This process involves a lot of assumptions, some of which are controversial, and this method is not common in wasting treatment, probably because the mortality prevented in CMAM programs is inherently assumed to make the benefits outweigh the costs. So we've mentioned this in previous slides, but just to put it all in one place, in economic analysis for CMAM, there's a few standard output and outcome measures that we typically use. So cases treated is not an effectiveness measure, it's an efficiency measure. And we can compare the cost per case treated with other CMAM programs. Cases recovered or cured is an effectiveness measure we can compare with other CMAM programs. Lives saved or deaths averted, we can compare with any other intervention that prevents mortality. And this requires the use of a counterfactual, which is an informed guess about what would have happened without the program, which Mark will be discussing more. Finally, disability adjusted life years, or DALYs, allow you to compare cost per DALY averted with programs addressing other diseases. It combines a measurement of the years of life lost and years lived with disability. And Mark will discuss this topic more. The final analytical output of a cost effectiveness analysis is a cost effectiveness ratio. And there are a couple of different kinds based on the question that you're trying to answer with your analysis. The first is an average cost effectiveness ratio. This involves taking all of the different program costs that we've added up, and we'll talk about this more in the next section. And we add all of these together to get an estimate of total costs. Then we take our various effectiveness measures and we divide the total costs by all of these measures one at a time. This could be, for example, the number of children recovered, the number of children treated, which is actually a cost efficiency measure, or the number of DALYs averted. This calculation gives you an average cost per outcome because it considers total cost divided by total outcomes. There may also be some instances where we care more about the incremental or additional costs to add on a specific program element. We could think perhaps of adding a cash transfer or an educational component in one district and comparing this to routine CMAM. This is where incremental cost effectiveness ratios come in handy. Here we have costs of routine CMAM. We'll call this program A. We have some costs from ministries of health, NGOs, and households. This program and these costs are for a district A. Then we have another area where we have the same routine CMAM being implemented, in addition to another component. This is where we're testing a new approach, and we have costs for these additional elements. Some costs from ministries of health, NGOs, and households. So in this district, we have the cost of A plus B. So we spent this additional money. This is our incremental cost. Now we look at the effect side. Here we have a certain number of wasting cases identified in program A, our routine CMAM approach. And here we have another number of wasting cases identified in our district where we're implementing our additional elements. Here's A plus B. You can see we have fewer cases of wasting with the innovation. So you prevented additional cases of wasting with the A plus B approach. This is the incremental effect or a number of wasting cases prevented. We divide the incremental or additional cost by the incremental or additional effect, and we get what is called an ICER, or an incremental cost effectiveness ratio. This is our additional cost per successful outcome, or dollar per additional case of wasting averted. So with that general overview of CEA, let's move on to look at some specifics for the costing of CMAM. On a very practical level, it might be most useful to think of whose costs we should include. This will depend on the purpose of your analysis, but there are some general options to consider. If we think about the total cost to implement a program, this could include contributions from a few different stakeholders. Certainly, we have the main implementing organizations, which could be an NGO or Ministry of Health. We also might have some other partners involved that contribute specific inputs, like technical support or monitoring. The classical example could be an integrated program where the Ministry of Health implements and an NGO provides technical support and monitoring. So both organizations are contributing to the functioning of that program. Also, in many cases, the participant households are contributing their time and resources for transportation, for example, to participate in the intervention. These can be important to collect in some contexts. So that's the who, but what costs do we include from these actors? This again depends on the purpose of the analysis. If you're doing a full economic costing, you would want to include any resources used regardless of who incurs the costs. If you're doing a budget analysis for a specific institution or donor, they may only care about the cost incurred by that organization on that budget. In terms of recommendations, for an economic costing analysis that is being conducted to inform programs and policy, it is best to include all costs that make a program function or that contribute to its quality. This means mapping all of your costs and being as thorough as possible in collecting them, and being clear when you're doing your reporting on what is and is not included in your costing. Having said this, a truly exhaustive costing exercise is usually not worthwhile, as there are some costs that might contribute to your program functioning, but they're too distant or far from your implementation context as to become somewhat irrelevant. For example, the cost to develop RUTF initially might be considered very critical for your program to be able to function, but those costs were incurred far in the past outside of your program timeframe. Also, costs from some international headquarters, either for an NGO or UN agency, may contribute to functioning, but all of these may not be feasible to collect within your study timeframe. We would advise to define early on what your quote unquote universe of costs will be in order to justify the scope of your data collection. This could also include, for example, at what level you will collect costs. Probably at the level of the field program, since this is about implementation, possibly costs of coordination at capital level. Sometimes there's an international headquarters office that contributes technical inputs. These are not always included. Rarely are costs included of nutrition cluster coordination, though this could be important for some programs. Regardless, define your universe of costs and stick to it. Please be aware of underreporting costs. Underreporting costs takes less effort and less time and makes your program look less expensive and more cost-effective. But there are some important pitfalls to this approach. Here we have depicted the vicious cycle of poor quality cost data. The first step is often to underreport costs to appear cheap or competitive, perhaps at the proposal stage. This means that we have perpetually under-resourced programs, and this results in poor quality programs because they don't have the resources they needed to function well. A good approach is to see costs as a test of program quality. Did the program invest enough resources to enable good quality functioning and effectiveness? If so, then that's a good unit cost to start from, and there will be variation from there. A simple way to avoid this vicious cycle is to ensure transparent reporting, documenting what costs are and are not included in an analysis to understand the generalizability of the cost estimates. This doesn't mean that cost estimates will be exactly comparable across contexts, but if you know what costs are included, you can decide how similar one set of costs is to another. So many of you probably have some experience in dealing with costs by working on developing or managing budgets for a program. This is a great start in cost documentation, but there's a lot more in preparing costs for an economic analysis in terms of costs that fall outside of the program spreadsheet. There are two broad sets of costs to consider, which relates to the analytical perspective you take for costing, whether institutional or societal. Institutional costs will almost always be included. This is the cost of intervention by the implementing organization and includes personnel, transport, medicines, and foods, and several other examples that we'll look at in a moment. We often need to go beyond the budget spreadsheet for a few considerations here. For example, if we're looking at the costs specifically for CMAM, we will need to conduct interviews with staff about their time spent specifically on CMAM. This is especially important for integrated programs where we're adding a new task, namely management of acute malnutrition, to an existing worker's workload. For example, a healthcare worker or community health worker. Getting transportation costs specifically for CMAM often involves looking at a vehicle log where these exist, or discussing with logistics teams about the different activities and programs that vehicles are used for, and how to apportion the time a vehicle fleet spends on CMAM. This can be important because these costs are often quite high. Very importantly, program inputs like medicines and foods are often donated, like RUTF, RUSF, CSB. And the cost of these items will need to be included in the cost estimates. We'll discuss that more in a moment. One last important consideration is how to apportion support costs. Usually time allocation data can help with this when dealing with cost used to support several different programs from one organization's office. It is important to include the cost of broader overhead and support, which helps a program to function effectively. In public health economics, these are referred to as above activity costs, and they're important for making the program run well. If these are not included, this again should be specified in your reporting. Societal costs, on the other hand, are the broader resources used that result based on program activities. This often focuses on time and monetary costs incurred by households participating in a program, or by volunteers who may not be paid, but whose work contributes to the functioning of a program. This can include the opportunity cost of the time of these individuals, which are not recorded in any accounting spreadsheets, and any cost for transportation or cost incurred while they are participating in program activities, such as food or hotel costs if overnight stays are required, etc. Depending on the program, collecting societal costs can give you very important information related to program access and barriers to coverage. One point, which could take a whole presentation in itself really, is the topic of time allocation. Measuring the time of different workers is always important for economic analysis, but especially for integrated programs, which represent more and more of our interventions these days, and rely on workers who may have multiple tasks in their workload. There are different methods depending on the precision of information that you need on an individual's time. At its most basic, you conduct interviews with staff at all levels and get their percent of time on CMAM relative to other activities. This could be for implementation or support of CMAM field activities. This usually involves walking through in the interview a usual day, week, or month of the person's work, depending on their work schedule. And with them, you determine a percentage of their time and hence their salary to allocate to CMAM. Once you have conducted several of these interviews at different levels, you can start to use this information to apportion overhead and support costs for different departments. An important cost component for CMAM programs is the therapeutic or supplementary food products that are used. These are not always included in the accounting data since they're often donated. So specific considerations apply for getting these costed, and there are a couple of different options, each with their own pros and cons. One option is to use a top-down approach. This includes using accounting data if possible, or the waybills from your logistics team or the UN organization that donated the products. This gives us the total cost of the shipment of the product, but we will also need to conduct some interviews to understand the cost incurred at port of entry and for transportation and storage of the product. All of these costs are important to get the food to the right place and to keep it safe until it is consumed, so they're important contributions to the program. A benefit of this approach is that it contains the total cost of the product, so you would be accounting for losses such as spoilage and theft in your estimates. A drawback to this approach is that this is the total cost of the shipment, but it may be different from what was used by your program. For example, if you're costing one district out of many. So you would need to estimate the amount used by your program out of the total. Another option is to use a bottom-up approach. This includes using monthly caseload data from your program and estimating unit cost of the food product. You build up monthly cost data from the unit cost of a sachet times the standard monthly consumption per child and multiply this times the number enrolled per month. This is essentially what is called an ingredients approach in costing. A drawback to this approach is that it does not reflect what actually happened in the program. It just assumes that all children consume the same amount and that there is no theft or spoilage. You can apply a % assumed wastage from interviews, but it is still just an estimate. One important point to mention is that once you have all of these various cost data sources, they should be compiled into one spreadsheet for analysis. And I often find that one of the important elements of difficulty in a cost analysis is how to organize this data, because there can be a lot of it. So I will show an example of what a main spreadsheet would look like and what I find is a useful way to organize the data. It involves summing the data per each input type by month. This could be coming from different budget documents from different donors. Monthly cost data is a manageable amount of data for analysis purposes and can help you spot data gaps and inconsistencies without getting bogged down by too many details. So let's take a look. So here we have a spreadsheet, a main analysis, cost analysis spreadsheet for a program. In this first column here, we have all the different kinds of inputs that would be used in the program, and they're organized by input type. This will probably look familiar as to what might be in a budget spreadsheet. So here we have program-specific staff, we have management staff, and I should say that this is a bogus spreadsheet with bogus numbers and sort of bogus input names, but it gives you an idea. Here we have specific implementation staff for OTP and TSFP, and for the stabilization center too, which is an important part of really any CMAM program. We have national coordination staff for an NGO. We have support staff at national level and at field level. And then we have our program costs. On this line, we have our RUTF, which we could be linking from other spreadsheets here for our bottom-up calculations or from a monthly average from a top-down calculation. And then we have different OTP, TSFP running costs, drug costs, stabilization center costs. We also here have our office running costs. These are the support costs that we discussed. So we have the support costs at the field office level, at the national office level, and transportation, freight, and then other direct costs. So this includes a pretty, I would say, representative list of what sorts of things are usually included in a cost analysis. And then here's what we have, those monthly costs that I recommended. This allows you to look at a whole year of costs really in one view, and you might have multiple years for your program. And then we have a sum per year, and this is a great way to sort of get the big picture while you have a slightly smaller picture available as well. And this is also a good place to do any currency adjustments or inflation adjustments that you might need to do for your analysis. And if you need to do any sort of categorizing of your costs, this is a good way to do it too, to do it by input line. And if you need to do any sort of activity allocation, this is a good way to do it as well, although that's beyond the scope of our talk today. But importantly, I wanted to show how the time allocation data fits in. So here we have assumed that for each input line, there's one time allocation that is coming from an interview with usually a person or people involved with an input. And that number is then applied to each of these monthly totals, so that the sum at the end of the year is just the amount of that input times the time allocation. And this is just, like I said, a mock spreadsheet. And usually you would have multiple tabs here that would link. You could have different tabs from different donor budgets linked, and then you would sum them here and apply the time allocation so that you could have just the amount that is attributable to your program. Sorry, I'm having some trouble sharing my mouse disappeared. So one note before, I'm really not able to make my screen be large. Sorry, my cursor disappeared. Okay, let's see. Is that up to this point, we've been talking about costs in a deterministic sense. In a given context, there's one monthly cost for monthly facility rental, vehicles, salary, etc. It can be helpful, though, to think about uncertainty in costs. For example, if we're extrapolating across context or doing a sensitivity analysis for a certain input. And I wanted to point out that Mark will be discussing uncertainty in his presentations, and that these concepts can apply to cost data as well. So thank you for listening, and I will turn this over to Mark.
So I'll start off talking about DALY, the disability adjusted life years, and I'll just cover the basic ideas and give a simple example of how they're calculated. Now, cost effectiveness, we're moving on from cost now to effectiveness, and it's cost effectiveness based on a very simple idea. We just divide the cost of the program by the outcomes of the program. Here, cost is the amount of money spent over a defined period of time, and outcome is the desired positive outcomes delivered by that program over the same period of time. So this is money we spent to achieve this number of positive outcomes. These are desired positive outcomes. So a simple example here is that the program cost 119,000, just 117,000, just under, and cures 659 cases. We divide the one into the other. We find that in this case, this program spent about $183 to recover a child, to cure SAM. And in this case, curing SAM is our desired positive outcome. And I think you should keep in mind that what you're interested in here is desired positive outcomes. Let's think about what these might be. And we might include cases treated as a desired positive outcome. Now, it is a positive outcome, and it's what we design to do, is to treat cases, find cases and treat them and bring them through to cure. But here, we're not talking about cure, we're just talking about treatment. And so the effectiveness, which is the cure rate, cured proportion, is not taken into account. This is not a cost effectiveness analysis because there's no effectiveness involved, it's a cost efficiency analysis. This type of analysis we only ever want to do for well-proven or highly effective treatments or for primary prevention like vaccine programs. You may see this in a comparative analysis of different types of CMAM programming. Cases recovered, cases cured. There's a number of cases treated by the program that were cured. And here, cure is a desired positive outcome. So this is a cost-effectiveness analysis. Lives saved, deaths averted, they're the same thing. This is the number of lives saved, which is the same as the number of deaths averted by the program. It's an important measure of cost effectiveness, and we'll use this a lot in the DALI calculations. And it's good, it's useful if your program is treating conditions that are associated with high mortality in young children. And SAM is one of those. The calculation of number of lives saved required the use of a counterfactual. And this is an informed guess what would likely have happened in the absence of the program. And we derive this from case recovered and expected mortality in untreated cases. Disability adjusted life years, this is averted, DALI's averted. This is based on the DALI, and this is a standardized quantitative measurement of the burden of disease that combines both mortality and morbidity. DALIs has some advantage over other alternatives. They're standardized, they're well defined, they're reasonably well understood, and they're frequently reported. They're a single metric. They combine negative effects of early death and mortality on well-being for a specific disease or treatment. So we've got a combination of mortality and morbidity. Mortality is not particularly difficult to quantify. It's the life expectancy minus the age of death for a case of disease. So if somebody was going to live for 60 years and they died at 6 years, then what we've got is we've got 74 years of death, 74 years of being died. And those 74 years would be called the years of life lost due to disease. The other thing is morbidity is not so easy to quantify. Each illness effect is given a severity rating called a disability weight. And this is determined using expert medical opinion, sometimes surveys, sometimes studies. Disability rates always range between 0 for fully healthy, not at all disabled, to 1, fully disabled, which is how you might describe death. A value of around 0.3 is typically used for a long-term chronic illness, but often you'll find they range quite widely between 0 and 1. Tables of agreed disability weights are published periodically for use in the global burden of disease studies. And it's these disability weights from the global burden of disease studies that we tend to use in cost effectiveness analysis and when we calculate our own DALIs. Now, it's important to note when you look at these disability weights that some of them have questionable face validity, in the sense they don't appear to accurately reflect the concept they purport to represent. One example, just picked at random from the tables, is that urinary incontinence has a disability weight of 0.142. And this is weighted as being more severe than treated paraplegia, which has a disability weight of 0.047. But treated paraplegia is commonly involves urinary incontinence. It might be called neurogenic bladder, as well as our disabilities. So it seems unlikely that treated paraplegia should be better than urinary, it should be a better disease, a less disabling condition, urinary incontinence. Another example is dental caries, tooth decay, is weighted at D is 0.081, but wasting, this is any wasting, moderate or severe, as a weight of 0.053. And I wonder if it's sensible to treat both tooth decay as worse, that is a more severely disabling condition, than emaciation. I don't think you can adjust these. If you adjust these, you're breaking the standardization. But these inconsistencies are gradually being resolved. So dental caries in 2002 received a weight of 0.142, which is quite high. And dental caries in 2019 received a weight of 0.01. So that's a disease that is a disease that was considered a few years ago to be quite severely disabling, has now turned out to be trivially disabling. The other case, we might combine disabilities associated with paraplegia in order to give a better weight to paraplegia. The problem we have, of course, is these disability weights are political in some senses, or economic in some cases, in that people that work in these fields like to up the disability weight to make their disease look more important than it is. So I think the British Dental Association did a good job for dentistry with their weighting of dental caries, and they got caught out in the end, but you can see how that works. So morbidity, it's the same as the deaths, and it's the morbidity multiplied by the duration of the disability multiplied by the duration of disability. And if we measure time in years, duration in years, we get the number of years living with disability for a specific disease. And as DALYs is years of life lost plus years lived with disabilities, we should keep track of the units of time used in each of the YLD and YLD calculations. So in calculations, this means we express disease, we express durations and times in years, or if we do them in months, we convert those months to years, and we make sure that we're using years of life lost and years living in disability. So now a quick example in plain language and simple numbers. Yeah? And here we're looking at type 2 diabetes, adult onset diabetes. So if the case is that an individual with adult onset diabetes dies at age 60, instead of the life expectancy without diabetes of 75 years, then somebody with adult diabetes will die 15 years earlier than somebody without it. So the years of life lost for each case of adult onset diabetes is 15 years. And then if we say if the mortality due to what we have for kidney, eye, neurological complications associated with diabetes is 0.5% disabilities for the final 10 years of the life, then we have 0.5 times 10 is 5 years living with disability, or 10 years living with a disability of 0.5. In this example, the overall disease burden is, in terms of DALYs, is years living with life, years of life lost plus years lived with disability. So that's 15 plus 5, so 20 DALYs. So the mortality and morbidity associated with adult onset diabetes in this example is 20 disability adjusted life years. 15 of those are deaths, 5 of those are a short period living with reasonably severe disability. Now, this is the mortality and mortality we see in the absence of an intervention. This is the counterfactual. Now, if we have an intervention that extends a life by 10 years, then that is no longer 15 years of life lost, it's 10 years of life lost. And if we can reduce the duration of disability, not reduce the disability, but reduce the duration of disability from 10 years to 4 years at the end of life, then the years living with disability are reduced from 5 years to 2 years. So that's the mortality we see in the presence of the intervention. This is the factual. This is what happens when we intervene. And we can say that, and when we do that, it's 10 plus 2, it's 10 years of life lost plus 2 years of living disability. So the DALYs associated with this is 10. No, it's 12, sorry, 10 plus 2 is 12. And we can say the interventions averted the difference between the counterfactual and factual, which is 8. So we've averted 8 DALYs by this intervention. Note here that DALYs averted is the health benefit of an intervention. It's reduction of mortality and morbidity compared with doing nothing, compared to the counterfactual. Health interventions always aim to avert DALYs. They always aim to avert mortality and morbidity. and we measure mortality and morbidity in a single indicator, single measurement called the DALI. This is a three-stage approach now. We assess the mortality and morbidity associated with the condition of interest in the absence of the intervention. This is a counterfactual. We assess the mortality and morbidity associated with the condition of interest in the presence of the intervention of interest. That's the factual. And we compare the counterfactual and the factual to find the reduction in mortality and morbidity averted by the intervention. So reduction in mortality and morbidity that is due to the intervention. Now this provides a useful framework for cost-effective analysis using DALIs, and we'll use it later on. So in a quick summary, DALI is a burden of disease. It measures it quantifies the amount of mortality in years of life lost and disability in years living with disability, or years living with disability of a certain severity. It's a common metric. It allows the direct comparison of burdens across diseases, as in the Global Burden of Disease surveys. It allows comparison of treated and untreated diseases. It allows the summing of burdens across diseases. And it allows the effect to compare the effect of different interventions. Cost-effectiveness analyses using DALIs can be complicated, and we'll see some examples of this later today, but they're usually conceptually simple. Now, a more complicated than the diabetes example is treatment for SAM, DALIs for SAM, CMAM treatment. So here we'll work with data from a CMAM program from Bangladesh. And this is one that, that Chloe and myself worked on several years ago. And it's the delivery of CMAM services entirely by community health workers. And here we can see the number admitted to the program was 711. The number cured, that is, they were discharged alive, 653. The average length of a cured episode was only 37.5 days. The average length for an untreated episode is 6 months, and that's from historical data. And the average minimum admission in this program was 106.7 millimeters. So what we'll do is we'll stick with the three-stage approach, look at the counterfactual, and see what the averted mortality and morbidity is in the counterfactual. So we'll look at the counterfactual for mortality. So we measure this in terms of years of life lost. We estimate years of life lost by estimating mortality in an imagined cohort of untreated cases with a similar severity of disease. That's a similar severity of disease as the cases treated by the program, and correcting this for a background mortality. So the expected mortality is the case fatality rate for untreated SAM minus the background mortality. We can find an expected case fatality rate in untreated SAM cases using historical data. And we'll have a look at the next figure here. So this figure shows the case fatality rates at different levels of MUAC in 4 historical cohort studies. The important thing to see here is that the shape of the relationship between mortality and MUAC is very similar, and it's often very, very similar. So this suggests that these studies are estimating the same underlying rates of mortality at different levels of MUAC. So we can combine them because they're roughly doing the same thing, these 4 studies. We look at the data we have from these 4 studies, and so we got 2 from Bangladesh, which was good for us because we're looking at Bangladesh, and then we got 1 from Malawi and 1 from Uganda. And these are the we see MUAC 100 to 125, and we see the mortality rates there. So the first top one there for Bangladesh from 1986 was at 100 millimeters. We'd expect 304 deaths per 1,000 children per year. Now, our average mu echo emission in the cured cases in our program was 106.7 millimeters. And if we look at table 2, we can see that there's no 106.7 millimeters in there. It's going to be somewhere between 100 millimeters and 110 millimeters, and we take some point along there that reflects 106.7 millimeters. And we can use a linear interpolation procedure. So in this figure here, figure 2, we've plotted the data for 100 millimeters, 105 millimeters. That's on the x-axis, and on the y-axis, we've got the height of the line is the mortality rate. And then we can find a point in the line that's above the 106.7 millimeters, and we'll track that back to the x-axis, which is the mortality. And we see it's about 220 deaths per 1,000 per year. Now, we can do that arithmetically, and the calculation here gives us 219.58. So it is about 220 deaths per 1,000 per year. So this arithmetic method here is doing the same thing as the graphical method. Now, what we should do is, because we've got these 4 studies and we think these 4 studies are measuring the same things, then we should repeat this calculation for the reported case fatality rates from each of the 4 historical cohort studies. And so this is what we get for from each of those 4 cohorts. So 106.7 millimeters. We find that that ranges from 220, roughly 220 to 329, and some in between there. And so we've got some variability, but I think it's reasonable from our inspection of our earlier figure, this one here, to assume that each study is estimating the same underlying rates, and the observed differences are due to varying lengths of follow-up, inconsistent censoring of accidental and violent deaths, measurement error, sampling variation. And I think what that means is that an average of the 4 case fatality rates is likely to provide a better estimate than is available from a single study. Now, the average we want to use here when we're working rates is probably the harmonic mean, and that's the total sample size divided by the sum of the reciprocals of the case fatality rates. And when we do that, we get an average case fatality rate of 245.93 deaths per 1,000 per year, and that's what we'll say is a good estimate, is our best estimate. The problem with this estimate, though, is that it includes baseline or background mortality, and so everywhere we go, children are dying all the time, and some of these children are included in our mortality rate. And so if we go ahead with this average that we calculated here, it might cause us to overestimate years of life lost, because we've got more deaths than directly attributable to SAM. We might have a large number of lives saved by the intervention, because we would estimate more deaths to occur than actually did or would have done. And the while averted component, the years of life lost averted, and the DALY's averted estimates might also be biased upwards. So we need to account for the baseline mortality. So when we look at the data from the Health Observatories, we find that that the average under 5 mortality rate for the locations and times that these 4 coast studies were done was about 1 per 10,000 children per day. And this is the same as 36.5 deaths per 1,000 children per year. And so if we apply this adjustment, our 245.93 deaths per 1,000 a year, adjusted with 36.5 for the background mortality, becomes 209.43 deaths per 1,000 per year. And we present that as proportion. So if we divide the 209.43 by 1,000, we get 0.20943, which is the same as 20.94%. So we've got an estimate of the mortality, and we've got an expected mortality proportion, and we've got the number cured. And if this was just the number of children with SAM, we'd expect that to be about 20.94% of the 653, which comes to 136.7, 137 deaths would have occurred without the intervention. So that would have occurred is the counterfactual. That would have occurred without the intervention is the counterfactual. And if we are to, so we can take that number of deaths averted and multiply that by life expectancy at the time of death, and that would give us years of life lost, or years of life lost averted. Now, one way of doing this is to use the standard life expectancy known as a standard expectancy, standard expected years of life lost, SEYLL. And this is the little table there shows in the first 5 years of life what the standard expected years of life lost. So at birth, we expect the child to live for 91.94 years. Whereas at age 5, we expect them only to live for another 87 years. Now, in our program, the average age of admission to the example program was 19 months. So we can express that in years. And time to death from when we get them in to the program to when they die, from when SAM starts to when they die, we have to guess at that. We have to make an informed guess of that. And a sensible guess might be that some deaths occur quite quickly, maybe about half all deaths after 2 months, and all deaths that can be reasonably attributed to SAM have occurred before 7.5 months. That 2 months where half all of them died is calculated here. Now, we join those together. Age at death can be calculated by adding that 2 months to the 19 months and divided by 12 to give us the years, and that's 1.75 years. Now we calculate the years of life averted, years of life lost averted, with the expected number of deaths, given the severity of the SAM that we were treating, times our life expectancy at birth, which in the standard expected years of life is 91.94 years, take away the 175 years, we multiply those two together and we get just over 12,300 years of life lost averted. Now, this approach, the SEYLL, the standard expected years of life lost approach, is currently recommended by the WHO for estimating burden. Prior to 2010, it was a common practice to use local life expectancies. Now, if we move from local life expectancies to using the standard expected years of life lost, this will usually increase estimates of YLL averted, the years of life lost that we avert by our program. Because the SEYLL, the standard expected years of life lost, is based on projections the year 2050, using data from developed countries with long life expectancy. In fact, this data is called Frontiers 2050, and it's a projection of life expectancy in Japan out to 2050. I think it might not be appropriate to estimate years of life losses versus from using SEYLL, because the CMAM programs, we often run these in lower middle income countries which have considerably shorter life expectancies than SEYLL. It may be more realistic to use local life expectancies. Now, using the health observatory figures, WHO global health observatory figures for the life expectancy of birth for Bangladesh for males and females at the time the program was running was 66.6 years. So this means a shift from using local life expectancy to standard expected years of life lost will increase the estimates of years of life lost averted by about 1.38. Oh, and we can just check this. So here's our years of life lost averted for in a program treating SAM cases of the same severity using the local life expectancy of Bangladesh. We find it's just over 8,800 years of life lost. The inflation is due, this is the denominator, the numerator here is using the SEYLL, the denominator is using the local life expectancy, and we find that's a 1.39, so 1.38, 1.39, it's close enough. Now, you might want to compare DALI averted between your programs reported DALIs calculated using local life expectancies. And if you want to do that, you'll need to use an estimate of local life expectancy to calculate years of life averted. And there are a lot of sources available for that. That's a well-published data set, routinely collected and published. And then we calculate years of life averted as we years of life averted, as we did always. It's the number of lives saved, number of deaths averted multiplied by the local life expectancy minus the average age of death. Yeah. So let's look at morbidity now. And here we're going to estimate the years living with disability, YLD, and the years lived with disability averted by an intervention. And that requires the construction of a counterfactual. Remember, the counterfactual is an informed guess of what would have happened in the absence of the intervention. So our basic YLD formula is the duration of disease episode multiplied by the disability weight for the disease of interest. And to get that duration of disease episode, we need to calculate the difference between the duration of episode, and we'll call that T, for treated and untreated SAM episodes. This then would be the duration of a SAM episode that is averted by treatment. Now, what we can use is we can use the duration of SAM episodes from treatment to discharge, or discharge as cured, in our program. And we'll have that from our routine program monitoring data. And we calculate that for recovered cases only. And treatment episodes resulting in death, transfer, or default, we don't consider those. We're only looking at successful treatment. What effect is successful treatment to have on reducing years living with disability? We usually know the length of the successfully treated episode of SAM. There's the length of stay in the program of SAM cases with the discharge as cured. And that's part of our routine program monitoring data. We don't usually know the exact local duration for an untreated episode of SAM. And so what we do here is we use 6 months, and this is derived from historical cohort data from Central Africa. And by historical, I mean it was collected in the late 20th century cohort studies. So if the length of a treated episode of SAM is 2 months, and the length of an untreated episode of SAM is 6 months, then our delta T is 4 months. The effect of treatment is to shorten the duration of the disease episode by 4 months. If the disability weight for SAM is D equals 127, and that's the 2010 figure, disability weight for the GBD, severe wastage would have averted 4/12, that's 4/12, that's 4 months as expressed as a year, time that disability weight, and so years of life lost averted is 0.423, and that's per SAM cases. Now we could calculate years of living disability averted for every SAM case discured from the program, and we could sum up the wildly averted figures, and that would give us an estimate of the wildly averted by the program. But working with individual data can be expensive and time consuming, and we've got issues of data confidentiality and data protection. It may be illegal in some settings, unless all our identifying data has been removed before we analyse it. We usually don't like to give individual patient data to analysts. So we usually work with summary measures, counts of cases, average lengths of treatment episode, average age of admission, those sorts of things, taken from routine program monitor statistics. So here's some additional background data for the CMAM program we're looking at. And here our average length of cured episode was 37.4 days. And the average length of the untreated episode is 6 months. And so here we can calculate the wildly averted, years lived with disability averted for a single case as that 6 months minus the 37.4 days, divide that by 365, so that now becomes a proportion of a year that was averted, multiplied by the disability weight for the condition. And we cured 653 cases, and so we multiply that individually calculated wildly averted by 653, and we get 32.97, almost 33 years living with disability averted by the program. Now, an interesting thing here is that we're treating SAM, but we've really only defined SAM as severe wasting. And that's usually an okay thing to do because kwashiorkor is a rare condition and tends to account only for a small proportion of program caseloads. In the Bangladesh program, there were just 6 cases of simple kwashiorkor and 7 cases of concurrent wasting with kwashiorkor, marasmic kwashiorkor. So these small proportions are not really going to affect our results very much. So the effect on our overall result will be small compared to the YLL averted for an acute condition associated with high mortality. And I think if you had a large proportion of SAM cases admitted with kwashiorkor, then you'd want to calculate wildly averted for each type of SAM separately and add them together. And it's relatively simple to combine the disability weights and use them in exactly the same way as up to now. Okay, I think we can stop if necessary and have some questions if there are any. Are there any? Or shall I continue? I'll continue then. So what we've done so far is we've just used simple numbers, simple counts from our routine monitor statistics and combine them together to give us point estimates of YLL averted and YLD averted, and we can add those two together and that gives us a point estimate of DALYs averted. But if we had a method that yields a range of values for the DALY components and DALYs that account for uncertainty and variability in mortality risk, duration, disabilities, and proportions cured, the result would be, I think, more useful and more credible. Now we have to do this, we have to account for uncertainty in our data. And we can do that by using a technique called triangular fuzzy numbers. And triangular fuzzy numbers account for uncertainty in a similar way that you might do if you were doing a more sophisticated sampling-based approach to uncertainty. A triangular fuzzy number the term comes from fuzzy set theory, is a generalization of a regular real number in the sense it doesn't refer to a single value. It's a set of connected possible probable values, with each of them having their own weight or membership function, which is a measure of the degree of the membership in the set of all possible values. The membership function, often called mu, ranges from 0 to 1. Impossible value has a weight of 0. The most likely value has a weight of 1. All other possible values, probable values, have weight of above 0 but below 1. The advantage using triangular fuzzy numbers is that we don't need to worry about specifying explicit mathematical or probabilistic membership functions. We'd only specify the minimum, the most likely, and the maximum values for each quantity. This is useful because in many situations we can usually estimate the minimum, maximum, and most likely values, and if we don't know the exact shape of the sampling distribution. We represent triangular numbers with 3 points. That's the smallest, most likely the maximum value for the quantity. For the minimum maximum, we can the most likely values to use. It's important to use typical values for the most likely value. This is usually a measure of the central tendency. So the median, the middle value, is a good measure of central tendency to use, as it is not overly influenced by extreme values. The mode and most common value and the mean are also useful measures of central tendency to use. You'll find that you might use one for one particular calculation and another for another. Minimum maximum values only cover the most likely range of values. This is the case when we use 95% uncertain limiters for disability weights or approximate 95% constant limits for proportions. And it's usually not a good idea to ignore extreme or outlying or these possibly erroneous observations when specifying minimum and maximum values. Including outliers can seriously degrade the precision of the final results in a Dally calculation. So let's have a look what a fuzzy triangular number might look like. So here there's a list of lowest, central, and highest values. So here, A, and we've got components A1, lowest, A2, most likely, or the central value, A3, the highest value. And so if we look at the duration of SAM, an untreated episode of SAM, it might last between 3.5 months and 7.5 months, with a most likely value of 6 months. And so this gives us A as 3.5, 6, 7.5. And we can represent these graphically. And so here's our lowest value of 3.5, our most likely value of 6, and our highest value of 7.5. Values below 3.5, they have no membership function. They're not included in the data. They're not included in the calculation. Values at the most likely value have the highest membership function. We look at the duration of a treated SAM episode here, and the ranges are between 1 month and 2 months. The central most likely value at 1.5 months. So these values here approximate our program data. The minimum length of stay in the example program was 28 days. It was a program rule. So the only exits before 4 weeks were transferred to hospital defaulters or deaths. 4 weeks is approximated as 1 month. The average length of stay in the program was 37.4 days. This is approximated as 1.5 months. And the maximum length of stay was 56 days, that's 8 weeks. And this was also a program rule. So beneficiaries that failed to meet discharge period of cure after 8 weeks were referred to hospital. 8 weeks is 2 months. And so this is our fuzzy triangular number as a expressed as a list or as a plot for untreated SAM, duration of untreated SAM. So here's our basic years of life, years lived with disability formula. That's the duration of disease times the disability weight. Now we need to work out the difference between the duration of untreated and treated SAM episodes. And those are the triangular numbers we've just been talking about. We want, so if A is our untreated duration in months and B is our treated duration in months, we want to find C, which is A minus B, the difference between treated and untreated cases. And we want to express that as a fuzzy triangular number. And we'll look at how these calculations are done in a minute. But it's simply here, we'll use the simplest method because we've only got positive numbers, there's no real complication in the calculation. And we see that A minus B is 1.5 to 6.5 with a most likely value of 4.5. We have a look at that in the graphically. And we can see here that here's our untreated duration, here's our treated duration. We're going to take this from this, and our calculation here is our A1, which is here, our 3.5, minus B3, which is 2. So that's where we get our 1.5 from. Our central value is here, is 6.5 minus B2, which is, I think is our 0.5. And here's our upper value, which is our upper value minus our lower value here, and that comes out as what is it? Comes down from 7.5 to 6.5. So we're doing an interval calculations here. Now, we'll look now at the basic arithmetic operations of fuzzy numbers, and let's assume that we've got A and B of 3, 6, 8 and 1, 2, 3. If we add them together, it becomes 3 plus 1, 6 plus 2, and 8 plus 3. So adding them together, we get 4, 8, 11. It's a similar process for subtraction, multiplication, and division. And these operations are the same operations that they're the equivalent of the ordinary arithmetic operations, the omission of addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, except we're applying them to fuzzy numbers. And the answers we get at the end of applying these to fuzzy numbers is a fuzzy number. There's some special cases. So if we're mixing fuzzy numbers and real numbers, sorry, here we go. If we're mixing fuzzy numbers with real numbers, then we just treat the real number as if it was a fuzzy number, but repeated 3 times. So here, we're using constants. Divide A by 12. Well, that's A1 upon 12, A2 upon 12, A3 upon 12. That's quite a simple thing to do. The fuzzy operations can be more complicated when we're dealing with zeros and negative numbers. In this case, we use a minimum and maximum rule. Looking at the operations A1, B1, A1, B3, A3, B1, A3, B3. The central value is very simple to calculate, and the upper value is also a little bit difficult to calculate. In this formula, the strange symbol, the circle with a dot in it, is the operation: addition, subtraction, multiplication, division. Min represents the minimum value of a set of numbers, and max represents the maximum value of a set of numbers. When we're doing maths like this, we have to take care to avoid division by 0. But then again, we always have to take care to avoid division by 0. It's unlikely that the more complicated minimax rule will often be needed in Danic calculations. Now, these rules, actually, I mean, you can see them. Yeah, they're there. They're there. They're not difficult, but they're tedious to perform. So, a subtraction, a simple operation becomes such as an addition becomes 6 additions rather than 1 addition. And these operations, the number of operations required, even for a simple calculation as adding 2 numbers or subtracting 1 number from another, means mistakes can be quite common. So it's usually best to use a fuzzy arithmetic calculator. And here's a fuzzy arithmetic calculator that we've developed to accompany the handbook. It's available free over the internet, and you can download the HTML file and you can start that from your file system and run it in your web browser. And what I shall do here is I shall stop sharing and then here we go. I'll see if I can find it for us. Here we are. Sorry. No, it doesn't look right. Let me see if I can find that again. So it's a relatively simple calculator. So if we do our 3.5, 6, 7.5, and then we put in our 1, 1.5, and 2, and we select our operation here. The calculator produces C, which is our answer: 1.5, 4.5, 6.5. And these are all expressed in months. And so what we could do here is we can chain these, and that brings the answer back up to the beginning, and then we divide by 12 for each of these. And that gives us our duration in years, which is what we want. And also what the calculator does is it gives us an estimate. So a point estimate is our central tendency here, and it then calculates a 95% confidence interval on that estimate. And we'd usually use this at the end of a chain of calculations. I'll go back to the presentation. So the calculations done with fuzzy numbers, they follow the same process as we did when we were dealing with real numbers. Except in this case, we calculate the, we chain the calculations together and we look at the 95% confidence at the end of each. We look at the 95% confidence and what they get at the end of the chain of each calculation. So 95% confidence are calculated geometrically. And so we have our result is a fuzzy triangular number, and then geometrically we can calculate where does 95% of the area of that triangle lie, and that is within the 95% confidence limit, the confidence limits. So here's the formula. Yeah, and again, it's a fuzzy calculation, and but these are also calculated by the fuzzy arithmetic calculator. Now, another calculator that we've developed that might be useful is a data flow calculator. It's a data flow is a way for writing programs for data calculations, and we developed that in Scilab and Xcos. And this is what it looks like. And very soon we'll have a live demo, if you can bear with me futzing around. Stop the sharing. Oh. So this is a playground which shows the chain of calculation and the calculations that go along the while here. So this is a duration of untreated disease, this is duration of treated disease, and this subtracts them. Yeah, this divides them by 12 to give us our years. Yeah, D is our disability weights. We multiply those by our difference in duration between treated and untreated disease. And here we're multiplying these by the number cured, and that's giving us our YL averted. And all the calculations we're doing are here. Here's interpolation done using the historical program data. And the calculations we're doing are exactly the same as we've gone through in the presentation. Then the nice way, the nice thing about this is we specify all the data, all the numbers using the calculation together on the same worksheet, if you like. But also we can play with these. So we'd expect here that if we had a more severe cohort, more severely emaciated cohort of beneficiaries, that we would, we can then just see what happens with that, and we can see that our Daly's averted increases from about 12,000 to 16,000, just by a difference of 2.7 millimeters here. Whereas if we manage to get our patients in and 10 millimeters, our days reduce because 110 millimeters as an average degree of emaciation, that we would expect to see fewer deaths than if we had 106 millimeters as our average mid-upper arm circumference of admission. So we can play around with our figures here. And see what effect they have on our daily calculations. Now, at present, you have to download Scilab and Xcos and load up this and run it inside that environment. But it is possible to put this on to run this in a web browser if needed. I'm going to stop sharing now. Go back to the presentation. I think I have it. Here it is. So that's another calculator you could use to simplify the calculations and the use of fuzzy triangular numbers. So finishing up, our full counterfactuals for DALIs averted for the Bangladesh program was the sum of years of life loss averted and years of disability averted from the counterfactuals, and that gives us just under 1,400 DALIs averted. Now, if we add our costs, we could just divide that into our 1,400, and that would give us a cost per DALI averted, and that would be our figure, our headline figure to present in our cost effectiveness analysis study. Now, these numbers would all be fuzzy triangular numbers, and we would probably apply some form of measure of fuzzy triangular number to our costs, and that would give us a cost per DALI averted with a range at a most likely value, well, or the value and a 95% confidence interval, which is what we tend to want. I'm going to stop sharing now. I think I've talked to you enough, and I'd like to answer any questions if there are any.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark and Chloe, for those really brilliant presentations. I didn't see any hands, but also I think we're just going to, we did answer many of the questions in the Q&A, so I think we'll answer any remaining questions as they pop into the Q&A, and we'll be sharing those answers as well. So thanks again, excuse me, for that. I did want to bring us back a bit to what Emily had introduced at the beginning of the webinar, and that is the wonderful sub-working group that is hosting the webinar, and the GNCTA who hosts the working group as well. As part of that working group and the work plan and the work that we do, one of our goals is information sharing and dissemination of costing data and cost effectiveness work. And so we have set up a web page for information sharing on the State of Acute Malnutrition webpage. The link is here where you can find that down on the lower left-hand corner. Where tools and guidance will be available, and there's already a link or two available on there, even though it's a brand new web page. There's also a link, I think a link back in both directions to the ENN forum. You can go to the next slide, please, Emily. I'm just going to kind of try to go quickly through these last slides. As part of the Global Nutrition Cluster, the TA, the GNCTA, there's a number of different avenues for you all to request and get support, which are listed here. And the best way to do that is to visit the website, which is listed here. And there's a form in the upper right-hand corner, which you can click on and submit any request for support that you might have, even if you're not fully aware yourself of what type of support you might be looking for. You can use that form to explore with them the type of support that you might need, whether that be looking for consultant support, technical support, peer-to-peer support. So please take advantage of that. You can go to the next slide, Emily. And this is what that site looks like, and the orange button on the upper right-hand corner is where that intake form is for requesting support. Go ahead. Yeah. All right. And that is everything. This, as Emily mentioned earlier, is one in a series of webinars. It's our second webinar. We are planning additional webinars, hopefully on a quarterly basis. As you leave the webinar today, when you click leave, there will be a evaluation or survey that pops up. So please fill out that. It's very brief. It should take you less than 5 minutes. It's really important for the GNCTA to get feedback on the webinar that was conducted today. And there's also a question in there about future webinars, and that will help us plan for future webinars as well. So if you could please fill that out, we'd all really appreciate it. And thank you again to Chloe and Mark, who did very great presentations for us, and also to our interpreters, and to all of the organizers and all of our participants as well.
Thank you, Stacy. And just to say, send apologies to the participants who might have been expecting Swahili translation. We were not able. We had some technical difficulties, and we were not able to provide that language. So our sincere apologies for that. Thank you.